Good evening. Thank you, Michelle and David. That was wonderful. That was from Bach, Cantata 51, as people may have seen earlier. Jauchzet, rejoice. And we are now at the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre. It's Friday, July 8th, and we are going to be discussing tonight Shelley, the poet who discovered the political mass strike. Today is the 200th anniversary of the death of Shelley, a great poet, and you will hear more about him from Paul Gallagher, and Jose Vega will be with us. I just wanted to say a couple of things which underscore the urgency of mastering and internalizing a poetic principle, because we are in an absolutely extraordinary situation, extraordinarily dangerous, but as often comes with great danger in transition, a moment of great opportunity as well. As people probably heard, the Prime Minister of Japan, former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, was assassinated, I guess today or yesterday, by a disgruntled former military person. I'm not going to say more about it, excepting that Abe had had no less than 27 meetings with President Putin of Russia, and that kind of relationship between Japan and Russia would be extremely important for the situation today. Unfortunately, the current government is not on friendly terms, and the deal they had to jointly develop the Sakhalin Islands has been terminated largely because of Japan's lining up with the NATO crew. So Abe's voice would have been very important in this moment. You also have, on a much happier note, the end of Boris Johnson's political career. Unfortunately, I don't see signs of anything particularly better than him coming in. It's hard to imagine something worse, but that's possible. And you should know that he has been in touch with Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, at least a couple times a week. So, true to form, the role of the British Empire in these conflicts is to put iron in people's spine, as Maggie Thatcher allegedly did with Bush Sr. to get him to launch the first war on Iraq in 1990. Zelensky has been ordered not to negotiate with Russia, not to come to any kind of settlement, but to keep on fighting until every last Ukrainian is ground up. So that is the situation there. But clearly what you see indicated is that great changes are going on. Now, we are coming off of the 4th of July weekend, where, as people may know, we had a mobilization to get out 100,000 leaflets with a statement I had written on the 4th of July and calling for a new Bretton Woods. What I know of at this point is that we distributed 35,000 leaflets over the holiday to great effect. We got a number of signatures on the new Bretton Woods as a result, and we're going to continue escalating the campaign. This question of the American Revolution is extremely important right now because, one, there's a massive slander campaign through cancel culture to convince people that the American Revolution was really some kind of British Empire on steroids, where a bunch of slave owners and drug pushers got together and created a dictatorship. That actually was not what happened in the American Revolution. Most of the founding fathers were vehemently opposed to slavery. They tried to actually outlaw it in the Declaration, or in the, I think, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They couldn't get it through then, but it was known that it would die out, except for the British imperial support of this and a certain British cat's paw through you could say Venetian and other banking circles in Boston. At any rate, there's been a fight through 246 years to establish the kind of republic that our founding fathers intended, a nation which acted for the liberty of all people on the planet, that recognized that every single human being is created equal in the image of the Creator and therefore has certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not the pursuit of pleasure, but what makes people truly happy is the ability to know that you have done something which contributes to your immortality, that you've done something for future generations, that you have lived outside the small bounds of your own personal mortal existence from birth to death. But there's something greater that each of us is a part of, and I think that's what Shelley really understood. So what I'd like to do right now is turn it over to Paul Gallagher, who is a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche. He is on the editorial board of LaRouche's journal Executive Intelligence Review, and he himself and his wife were political prisoners during the time that LaRouche was targeted and jailed on behalf of the British Empire by Bush and others around him. So, Paul, why don't you go ahead? You're muted, Paul.
Sorry, and thanks again. As you mentioned, July 8th of 1822, 200 years ago, Percy Shelley died while sailing his boat in a squall. It may have been an accident, it may have been deliberate. There was a collision of boats, and if he was killed at that point by the military oligarchical complex from England, who were his enemies, then they didn't do it on the first try. There had been at least one previous one. And he was English. He was not British. He was an English poet. He wrote a new national anthem, which he called that, a new national anthem, which begins, well, I unfortunately don't have Michelle to sing it here, but God prosper, speed, and save. God raise from England's grave her murdered queen. Pave with swift victory the steps of liberty, whom Britons own to be their immortal queen. Queen Liberty, at that time, England didn't have a queen, but a mad old king, George III. So they were singing God Save the King at that point. But Shelley, there's 5 more verses to it. Shelley was determined. He was a determined political organizer, determined to bring about or somehow help to bring about a political and philosophical revolution of society. The most overtly political of the great poets by far constantly wrote poems, not simply satires like that, but poems about liberty, liberty in Greece from the Ottoman Empire, freedom of Spain from British domination, and many, many songs to the men of England to rise up. But in his lifetime, he was called an antichrist in British media and journals. Essentially, nothing that he wrote was published while he was alive. There was, just to give an indication of the determination and the antipathy in which he was held by ruling circles in Britain at the time. In 1820, when he was in Italy, and his close acquaintance Byron, the poet, was with him, along with some retainers of Byron. They went to a post office. They rode to a post office, went in there for Shelley to pick up his mail, and a British Army officer who happened to be in the post office at that time looked at the envelope, saw who was picking up his mail, and immediately pulled out his pistol to murder Shelley. This was stopped by Byron and his retainers. So there was no murder at that time, but the fact that this British Army officer thought that on sight one should murder this poet if they saw him. Here's an example of an obituary that was published in the Tory publication, The Courier, when Shelley died. It said, quote, "Shelley, the writer of some infidel poetry, has been drowned. Now he knows whether there is a God or no." That was the whole thing. He was surveilled from the time that he was 19 by police agents of British intelligence. And I maintain that he was not really a poet, but rather a political organizer, a pamphleteer who turned to poetry in order to advance the cause of his revolutionary political ideas. And for example, at the age of 19, he already had written a really beautifully written pamphlet appealing to the Irish people who were in the middle of a kind of a mass strike called the Catholic Emancipation Movement in 1812, and went to Ireland with that pamphlet to distribute it himself, spoke at public meetings, intervened wherever he could on behalf of the content, which I'll get to in a second. And he was followed everywhere he went, so much so that when he was taking the ferry back to England from Ireland, he put his remaining pamphlets on the ferry ahead of him. And when he got to the English shore, they of course were gone. They had been wrapped up in a package, and they had been observed and had been taken. So he died 10 years after that. So there was little time for him to become the poet that he became. And yet so many people are really moved by the beauty of his greatest poems, which are not considered to be political at all, but in their metaphorical power, they really are. So this pamphlet of 1812, I'd like to read to you from that, so you get an idea of what I'm talking about when I say that this was the poet who discovered the political mass strike. This is what he said to the Irish people. These are quotes from that pamphlet in 1812. "A crisis is now arriving which shall decide your fate. Man cannot make occasions, but he may seize those that offer. None are more interesting to philanthropy than those which excite the benevolent passions that generalize and expand private into public feelings and make the hearts of individuals vibrate not merely for themselves, their families, and their friends, but for posterity, for a people, till their country becomes the world and their family the sensitive creation. I perceive that the public interest is excited. I perceive that individual interest has, in a certain degree, quitted individual concern to generalize itself with universal feeling. A benevolent and disinterested feeling has gone abroad, and I am willing that it should never subside. I desire that means should be taken with energy and expedition in this important yet fleeting crisis to feed the unpolluted flame at which nations and ages may light the torch of liberty and virtue. The crisis to which I allude as the period of your emancipation is the increase of virtue and wisdom." So that, I think, is a definition already of an idea of a political mass strike. That is one in which, and we are familiar with this for 55 years of Lyndon LaRouche talking about it, one in which the people are excited, certain groups of people are excited into action, and at the same time, they understand and take the needs of other people as being directly connected to their own, and in fact, even being the same to their own, and are even able to think of this in terms of people who are excited by the same crisis in other countries and take their needs and their demands as well as being their own. So it's a fundamental discovery that he made in the writing of this pamphlet and the organizing with it. And it was made at a time when he had really not written any serious poetry, not any poetry that was worth saving, a few juvenile satires, and that's about it. So he was not a poet at that time, and yet in 10 years, he had written some incredibly beautiful poetry. I know that people are, if I can find it here in this marked up book, I will. People are very familiar with the hymn to intellectual beauty, or many people on this call are. And that's one of those poems. It's long, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it begins, The awful shadow of some unseen power floats, though unseen, among us, visiting this various world with as inconstant wing as summer winds that creep from flower to flower, like moonbeams that behind some piney mountains shower. It visits with inconstant glance each human heart and countenance, like hues and harmonies of evening, like clouds in starlight widely spread, like memory of music fled, like aught that for its grace may be dear and yet dearer for its mystery. Spirit of beauty, that dost consecrate with thine own hues all that thou dost shine upon of human thought or form, where art thou gone? This was written in 1816, a period of intense reaction. Lyndon LaRouche will discuss that later. But here's the way it ended. This is the final stanza. The day becomes more solemn and serene when noon is past. There is a harmony in autumn and a luster in its sky, which through the summer is not heard or seen, as if it could not be, as if it had not been. Thus let thy power, which like the truth of nature on my passive youth descended, to mine onward life supply its calm, to one who worships thee and every form containing thee, whom, spirit fair, thy spells did bind to fear himself and love all humankind. Now, unless you're very familiar with that poem, that's not where you thought it was going. That's not what you thought the last lines were going to be. You thought they were going to be beauty is truth, truth, beauty, and that is all you know on earth and so forth. But instead, he speaks of the spirit of intellectual beauty. Thy spells did bind to fear himself and love all humankind. So this again is the same thing as he said in the pamphlet. When individual feeling is generalized and begins to deal not only with the family, with the immediate interests, but with the whole of sensitive creation, as he puts it, then there is a crisis which had arrived, which, as he was saying to the Irish in that pamphlet, that crisis will be the period of your emancipation. There's another one, which people are also very familiar with, and it's also very much beloved, but I won't read it all, but the Ode to a Skylark, which begins, hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, that from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Higher still and higher from the earth thou springest, like a cloud of fire, the deep blue thou wingest, and singing still dost soar, and soaring ever singest. This is, of course, what skylarks do. They leap up from the earth and fly almost straight up to a great height while singing. I mean, you have it in Shakespeare's sonnet, when in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee. And then my state, like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. So it's the same image. Another English poet who was also very familiar with skylarks in the fields in the morning, leaping up into the sky while singing. But again, a little bit in this poem, he starts to talk about this, well, he says, bird thou never wert. He starts to talk about this spirit of liberty as other things. Like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden, till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. So he's now the poet is trying to bring the world to sympathy with hopes and fears that it heeds not. And then when he ends the poem, he says of the unpremeditated art of the bird, if he could have that, better than all measures of delightful sound, better than all treasures that in books are found, thy skill to poet were, thou scorner of the ground. Teach me half the gladness that thy brain must know, such harmonious madness from my lips would flow, the world should listen then, as I am listening now. And again, you didn't expect that last line at all. That isn't where you thought it was going, that this hymn to this bird, which obviously is liberty and is poetry, that it would end by the world. If I could only sing with unpremeditated art, as you do, then the world would listen then as I am listening now. So again, that same desire. And in the course of that brief life, adult life of his, gradually poetry comes in. And he begins to talk about the connection between, and to discover and to write about the connection between poetry and a truly philosophical and revolutionary uprising. For example, in the preface that he wrote to his play in verse, Prometheus Unbound, in 1818, he says, the great writers of our age are, we have reason to suppose, the companions and forerunners of some unimagined change in our social condition, or the opinions which cement it. The cloud of mind is discharging its collected lightning. So this was the cloud of mind, obviously meaning the people, the minds of the people are discharging their collective lightning, and it is being reflected in the quality of the writers of that day, in the force of the poetry that they could write. Then in the philosophy of reform, which is one of his pamphlets, it was written in 1819. Like all of his pamphlets, it was never published, or in two cases, he managed to get printers to make print runs of these pamphlets. In both cases, the printers were promptly arrested. So after that, his pamphlets were no longer printed at all, and really not even known while he was still alive. But in the philosophical view of reform, he wrote, for the most unfailing herald or companion or follower of an universal employment of the sentiments of a nation to the production of beneficial change is poetry. Meaning by poetry an intense and impassioned power of communicating intense and impassioned impressions respecting man and nature. The persons in whom this power takes its abode may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little tendency to the spirit of good of which it is the minister. But although they may deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve that which is seated on the throne of their own soul. And whatever systems they may have professed by support, they actually advance the interests of liberty. It is impossible to read the productions of our most celebrated writers, whatever may be their system relating to thought or expression, without being startled by the electric life which there is in their words. They measure the circumference or sound the depths of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit at which they themselves are perhaps most sincerely astonished, for it is less their own spirit than the spirit of the age. They are the priests of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they conceive not, the trumpet which sings to battle and feels not what it inspires, the influence which is moved not but moves. Poets and philosophers are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, wrote Shelley in that pamphlet, which was a pamphlet on political reform, particularly the reform of the suffrage and the quality of mind necessary for the citizen, the subject in that case, to exercise the power of the subject of the suffrage for improvement. So now I want to play what I think is the first time in a lecture that Lyndon LaRouche discussed this, and keeping in mind that this was in 1973, in November of 1973, at the beginning of a series of lectures, recruiting lectures, training lectures, which he gave to graduate students and other students that had joined his movement over the previous 5 years. And in that 5 years, he had not stopped organizing them around the idea of a political mass strike and citing Shelley as he went along. And I have to give thanks to Debbie Sonnenblick, who sent me today a facsimile of a 1968 pamphlet, very short pamphlet, written by Len, called The Mass Strike, in which he makes reference, perhaps for the first time in print that we saw, to the defense of poetry of Percy Shelley. But here he is talking about it and reading what's become the more famous version of that quote, which I just read you from the pamphlet. This he wrote 2 years later in 1821. So if I can get it shared here, we shall see.
During a period of reaction which occurred among British intellectuals in the wake of the French Revolution, there was an attempt to explain creativity in art as being something which occurred within art itself, as independent of political movements at that time. In rebuttal of this, Shelley wrote an essay, one of several important essays, and I'll refer to another one later tonight, entitled In Defense of Poetry. And I shall read a section from the conclusion of that, which is a thesis from which we shall work to provide a setting for the purpose of this program. The literature of England, an energetic development of which has ever preceded or accompanied a great and free development of the national will, has arisen, as it were, from a new birth, in spite of the low-thoughted envy which would undervalue contemporary merit. Our own will be a memorable age in intellectual achievements, and we live among such philosophers and poets as surpass beyond comparison any who have appeared since the last national struggle for civil and religious liberty. The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The persons in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the ministers. But even whilst they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve the power which is seated on the throne of their own soul. It is impossible to read the compositions of the most celebrated writers of the present day without being startled with the electric light which burns within their words. They measure the circumference and sound the depths of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit, and they are themselves perhaps the most sincerely astonished at its manifestations, for it is less their spirit than the spirit of the age. If Shelley's thesis is correct, that is, that great periods of revolutionary transformation are heralded and accompanied by an intellectual renaissance, then the Bolshevik Revolution and the period following it is ironical. For the Bolshevik Revolution was preceded by approximately a quarter century of general decay, accelerated decay of intellectual life in Europe and the United States, and has been followed by 50 years of accelerated decay in the arts. The situation in the sciences is not that much better. While there has been much elaboration, which is called fundamental advance in the physical sciences, so-called, there actually has been no breakthrough during the past 50 years, nor any sign of a new breakthrough in development, but rather an elaboration of those achievements, the fundamental achievements, which were made in the first 2 decades of this century.
I stopped there because I forgot to follow Jose's instructions and I didn't know if you were hearing it. Were you?
We certainly were. I was hearing it okay.
Oh,
I was
okay.
able to
Yeah.
tell.
Okay. Well, that was the way that Lynn introduced Shelley into the understanding of the mass strike, which he was trying to communicate to a broader grouping of recruits in 1973. I want to just to close what I'm saying here by reading one paragraph from another pamphlet of Shelley's, which I think really condenses the point that I've been trying to bring out. He said, "The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our own nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person not our own. A man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry ministers to this effect by acting upon its cause. Poetry strengthens that faculty which is the organ of the moral nature of man, in the same manner that exercise strengthens a limb." Okay.
Great. Thank you. That's actually quite wonderful. I have Jose Vega on with us, who was one of our petitioning volunteers and participated in our nightly Zoom meetings as we were going through that horrible grind of collecting the 66,000 signatures. And poetry actually became a crucial part of those meetings, particularly Shelley, particularly what you just referenced, Paul. So he may have some thoughts, and then I have some questions, or I'd like to draw out more this question of the mass strike, because I think to many it's not very clear, or it's hard to imagine what that is. But Jose, if you want to go ahead.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just managing these things as we go. Also running the show. So just give me one quick
I
second.
thought I was running the show, Jose.
He's what's called the showrunner nowadays.
Yeah, so I was a petitioner. I was out pretty much every day. A couple days I took off, but towards the end, I don't want to do too much here. I don't want to pretend like I know everything about poetry or nothing. Paul, that was a wonderful presentation, and I do have some questions, not just about Shelley, but about Keats also. But I'll save those for the Q&A. I'll just give a report about how poetry fit in during the petitioning period. In the beginning of petitioning, we were all still trying to find our footing. We were trying to figure out what is the best way to approach somebody. What is the best way you can get somebody to sign? It's, it's not easy going up to strangers and getting rejected 3,000 times a day. And then, out of those 3,000, 100 or 120 people, decide to sign your thing. it's not easy. And in the beginning, you know, people ask like, well, who is Diane Sayre? Why should I sign for her? And we were basically pleading like, listen, we need to get 100 people to sign. We don't have the time to really explain. Here's a card. And the last like 2 weeks of petitioning, I was just out of it. I was burnt out because I was like, oh, don't ask me who Diane is. I just want these signatures. And the quickest way to preempt it was, hey, if you sign, I'll read you a poem, like, or I'll recite you a poem. Like, oh, okay, all right, fine. So people would sign just for that, and I would read them. It was either Shakespeare, and it was the sonnets that I know from memory, or it was two Edgar Poe poems. One was the name escapes me. It was, you know, gaily bedight, a gallant knight in sunshine and in shadow, El Dorado. That's the name of that poem, and A Dream Within a Dream. And then the sonnets, I was reciting Sonnet 73, Sonnet 138, Sonnet 2, and there was one other sonnet that I was reciting. I was just, you know, throwing these around, and there was an interesting effect because people said, "Wow, you know, I'm glad I signed," because there is an uplifting aspect to the poetry, right? It's not just a gimmick. You know, especially when people started telling me like, "Thank you, you made my day." Or when I would recite the poem like 138, which is about love and couples, right? And then an old couple would sign, and then they would be laughing at the poem. Or if I read A Dream Within a Dream to some teenager who an over 18-year-old registered voter who technically is a teenager, would sign, and they think, yeah, I'll take the Poe poem because, you know, they think Poe is cool, and then they're like, wow, yeah, that's great. You know, and then there's one artist who liked it so much, recorded me down in Union Square, and he posted it to his Facebook. I was reciting Sonnet 73, that time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon the boughs that shake against the cold bare ruined choirs. That one's like my favorite sonnet. And so he recorded me reciting it, and he put it up on his Facebook, and like, you know, his friends shared it around, and it was shared around, and it was great. You know, the impact, I guess basically I wanted to give the impression that we weren't like any other people out here petitioning. We actually care. And so that's why I really cared with the clip that you played, Paul, with Lynn saying, you know, any great period of history that has a revolution has to have an intellectual revolution too, right? A period of great beauty has to accompany it. And that's why he references the Bolshevik Revolution. That's why it didn't work out. Because you need that cultural aspect of it too. And that's something that I'm trying to emphasize with this campaign too. It's not necessarily just about the pragmatic politics of, are you pro-choice? Are you pro-life? Are you this? Are you left? Are you right? No, we are about changing something for the better as a whole. We're more than just that. We are not that. You know, we're trying to make daily life better for people and have people live in a better culture where people want to wake up and want to understand these ideas of beauty. And I'll just say one more thing. Every night after we were all exhausted, we would get on these Zoom calls at these debriefings, and we would always start with a report and then a poem. You know, find out what's going on in the world and then how to think about what's going on in the world. So that was fun. And so I think I'll just end it there.
Thanks. Paul, any thoughts? And don't forget to unmute.
Well, I hope you didn't report to the authorities in Albany that Jose was paying people to sign the petition. That was pretty good pay, the best kind. That's really great. It's great that it worked, and that's exactly what Shelley was talking about. So I don't think I need to say more. I wanted to read one other thing, but if it's up to you how we go.
Go ahead, please. This is wonderful.
This is the second big discovery that he made, in my humble view. That is the discovery of creative nonviolence, nonviolent civil disobedience. This was a pamphlet he was writing. It's the same pamphlet, another chapter of the same pamphlet. This is one of the most extraordinary political and philosophical pamphlets that has never been published. It really exists only in a collection of essays that appeared 100 years later. So it's never appeared as a pamphlet at all. But it's just really extraordinary. Economic analysis of the impact of the Bank of England's formation on the ruin of the English population. And Shelley knew what he was talking about politically. But he said this about demonstrating for the suffrage, which was his subject here, because the English, the Chartist movement, were holding demonstrations for the suffrage. He said, the true patriot will endeavor to enlighten and to unite the nation and animate it with enthusiasm and confidence. For this purpose, he will be indefatigable in promulgating political truth. I'm skipping a little here. He will discourage all secret associations, etc. He will urge the necessity of exciting the people frequently to exercise their right of assembling in such limited numbers as that all present may be actual parties to the proceedings of the day. Lastly, if circumstances collect a more considerable number, as at Manchester on the memorable 16th of August, if the tyrants command their troops to fire upon them or cut them down unless they disperse, he, the true patriot, will exhort them peaceably to risk the danger and to expect without resistance the onset of the cavalry and wait with folded arms the event of the fire of the artillery and receive with unshrinking bosoms the bayonets of the charging battalions. Men are every day persuaded to incur greater perils for a less manifest advantage. And this, not because active resistance is not justifiable when all other means shall have failed, but because in this instance, temperance and courage would produce greater advantages than the most decisive victory. The soldiers are men and Englishmen. Then an analysis of the mind of the soldier confronting such a manifestation, such a demonstration. If they run from him, he chases them to kill them. If they draw themselves up without violence to resist, he stops. He compares it to a dog, a shepherd dog who chases sheep until they come to the corner of the meadow up against the fence. They turn around and face him and they won't move. And the dog stops barking and sits down. But he says, these are not dogs. These are men and Englishmen. This unexpected reception would probably throw him back, the soldier, back upon a recollection of the true nature of the measures of which he was made the instrument. And the enemy might be converted into the ally. So that, I think, is really short of nothing to be describing creative nonviolent civil disobedience in 1819. So you can measure that against the development of the idea which took place after that. But what an extraordinary political mind this person we know as a great poet actually had. And of course, everyone who knows the Mask of Anarchy, that great poem, knows that the ending of that poem is an exact poetic repetition of what I just read you from the pamphlet. And in fact, the poet and the poem and the pamphlet were written in the same month, in the same week, in August of 1819. He was writing the pamphlet. He heard about the massacre at Peterloo of the cavalry battalion which slaughtered these demonstrators for the suffrage in a meadow. And he then put the pamphlet down and wrote the poem in a tremendous fit of anger, as his friend Leigh Hunt said, and then picked up the pamphlet again and wrote what I just read you. So the poem got him to that point. And like the pamphlet and like virtually everything else he read, even his friend Leigh Hunt was afraid to publish it. So, because he knew that if he did, he would probably be taken to jail. Hunt would probably be taken to jail. And so that poem also, and that pamphlet, waited decades until after Shelley's death, to finally see the light.
Paul, could you say something from this standpoint about the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. That's exactly what Shelley was responding to, and Lynn referred to it, the period of reaction. And he said, in the period of reaction following the failure of the French Revolution, the idea arose that art was simply art for art's sake. It had nothing to do with public consciousness, political movements. And so Shelley wrote this essay against that. Shelley began his work, his political pamphleteering work, in 1812 during the Napoleonic Wars, when there was still the strong impetus of the American Revolution with its. The American Revolution was not nonviolent, but as we know, it employed an absolute minimum of military violence, losing almost every battle which the Continental Army fought in order to win the war. And it concentrated its efforts on the recruitment of the population to support it with the pamphlets which were written at that time, which appealed to them to awake their higher nature and fight for the liberty and the rights of all men, not for themselves against the Tories or themselves against the British Army over New York, but for the rights of all men. And this revolution was communicating itself through Europe in the 19-year-old Shelley's pamphlet to the Irish people. He discusses the American Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which had just then been written by Jefferson and Lafayette in a collaboration. Says it's the most perfect document of rights that he had seen thus far. And he realizes very quickly after that, the failure of the French Revolution. He wrote an entire epic poem about it called Leon and Sithna, about the failure of the French Revolution, because it did not, it was a revolution which mobilized rage, hatred and rage, exactly the opposite of, including class hatred and caste hatred, exactly the opposite of what he said the nature of poetry and the nature of crises of emancipation really were.
You know, this brings up, Jose may have something also, but we had a very dear friend who I would say died under suspicious circumstances in a fire, who taught at West Point, who gave us a tour, and one of the things he said is that it was almost always the case that the winning side in war was the one that actually sustained the greatest number of casualties. Because I think the question of the commitment is not, are you willing to kill someone else, which is already a kind of degradation of humanity? How can you represent a universal principle if you're going to measure your victory in the number of deaths, like body count Bob during Vietnam or any of these things? But if there's a principle so precious that you yourself would give your life for that principle, then there is a certain moral, not just authority, but a certain strength and morality to that. And I think Martin Luther King telling the idea of love thy enemy is related in that, because as soon as you hate, as soon as you succumb to rage, your whole process of thinking is warped and you lose the edge that you may have had. There's a very negative quality about that. But I just found this interesting, and I've been reflecting greatly, having seen some interviews with some of the Russian soldiers by this on-the-ground journalist that people may be familiar with, Patrick Lancaster, who interviewed some of the soldiers who were liberating places from the Ukrainian Nazis. And you see this quality. They said, look, we're not here to kill people. If the army on the other side, which is using civilians as human shields, would just willfully surrender, We will treat them well, we will not humiliate them, and when we're done with our mission, they will be returned to their families. And you just had a sense of calm and morale because the mission was clearly defined and the atrocities were being committed by the people they are fighting, but there is no idea of committing atrocities in return. But that's not how you win the war. And I think this is really important for right now because people are suffering such injustices, and the hyperinflation is causing extreme anxiety, and people tend to get obsessed with personal survival and therefore see other human beings who are also obsessed with their personal survival as competition or the enemy. And unless we can get into a different place and a different frame of mind about this, we're going to really squander an incredible moment. As people know, we didn't reference this, but there's been tens of thousands of farmers blocking roads in the Netherlands. There's been huge strikes of taxi drivers in France. People saw the truckers in Canada. There's an enormous kind of process, but how do you make sure that it is ennobled to the point to actually liberate people from the oppression that they're experiencing?
Jose, you said something about Keats?
Yes, but actually I was going to ask, because on the point that you just raised about the French versus American Revolution, there were attempts to kind of inject sanity back into the French Revolution. I mean, you have the painting by Jacques-Louis David, among many, The Death of Socrates. And you also have some of the founding fathers going to and fro from France to try and steer the thing back. But I'm very interested in this idea that Jacques-Louis David is using. He's coming at this angle of trying to inject sanity into the French Revolution through culture, right? He's making a painting, right? In the middle of this violence, in the middle of what's going to become a very bloody revolution, right? He's making a painting. Now, can you speak as to these attempts? Why is it that it wasn't successful in steering back the French Revolution into something greater than it ultimately became and boiled down to?
Oh, I just think the turning point came earlier. I don't know if he also painted the tennis court oath. That's another famous painting that comes from, but that tennis court oath was in 1790, the beginning of 1790. At that point, you could definitely say that what the leaders in France, who were very pro-American, what they were after was reform. They did not see themselves as conducting a revolution, but making a reform, a beneficial reform, and in an American sense. And of course, Lafayette bridged back and forth between the two, and he had this kind of partnership with the mayor of Paris, Bailly, who was a leading astronomer of the time. He was really quite a scientist. He discovered many of the moons of Jupiter. Lafayette and Bailly, Lafayette was the head of the National Guard, and Bailly was the mayor of Paris. And the two of them together were trying to hold the forces, beneficial forces, in favor of a reform, but a reformed monarchy. And the other monarchs of Europe simply, and the other oligarchs of Europe, intervened in such a way as to cause chaos. And once the armies got involved, especially the Austrian, once the Austrian monarchy and its army got involved, it was a terrible thing. And to a certain extent, the horrors of the terror in Paris were in reaction to the horrors being carried out by the Austrian armies, until Carnot mobilized an army which could push them back and defeat them. But by then it was entirely a military contest, one which was going for conquest rather than the uplifting of the nation. So I think that's why, well, I'm no expert in it year by year, but there were just terrible, terrible things done, especially by the Austrian relatives of Louis XVI and by the French oligarchs, like that character whose name I forget now, the Duc d'Orléans, who was running the revolutionary centers in Paris. It just got away from them.
Well, we have to make sure that that doesn't happen this time.
They didn't do what they had to do. They had to reform the king out of office, especially this king, Louis XVI, with his miserable international connections and relatives. They had to reform him out of office. And there were factions that wanted to elect Lafayette to be president of France. But he unfortunately did not countenance that. Otherwise, something better might have happened.
Very good. Well, I think it is time for us to wrap up. Let me ask Jose or Paul if you have any closing thoughts. Jose, do you have anything?
Yeah, peace and love to the world and to mankind. That's it.
Hard to object. I would add to it, Shelley's life demonstrates that it's good if you are a political organizer to try your hand at poetry.
Good advice.
You may get successful, not only reciting it, but even composing it. You may get successful.
Well, I want to thank both of you. Thank you, Paul, very much. Really, that's wonderful. It's food for the soul. We have a very tough battle ahead, but I don't think it's going to be a long one. The current system is clearly in its death agony, so it is really upon us to keep our spirits, our reason, our morale, and to fight for what's needed, which, as people know, I and my colleague Joel DeJean, the candidate for Congress in the 38th District in Texas, have both signed on to the call by the Schiller Institute launched by Helga Zepp-LaRouche for a new Bretton Woods conference. And if you think about the domain of poetry, where it is, and the fact that things can change in an instant, I would urge people not to cynically write off the idea that nations, even as bizarrely as certain governments are conducting themselves at the moment, can actually come together for the good of mankind. And I think that is really going to depend on the people, as it says in the preamble to our Constitution, we the people, as was pointed out by my campaign historian Bob Wesser last night. It doesn't say this legislative body or something else. It's incumbent on us to do this. And my campaign is playing a role in that. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and participating. If you aren't a volunteer, if you would like to donate, if you'd like to distribute the paper, please sign up at sayerforsenate.com. And with any luck, we'll be here again next week. Thank you.